Good morning, everybody. I'm Elaine Katz. I'm Senior Vice President of Grants and Communication at Kessler Foundation. We're actually a separate organization from Kessler Institute. A number of years ago, we separated, and we changed the lives of people with disabilities through rehabilitation research and also funding employment programs for individuals with disabilities. On our research side, we seek to improve cognition and mobility and work with people with stroke, spinal cord injury, traumatic brain injury to improve daily function and help them return to their lives. Our Center for Grant Making over the past 12 years has invested close to $44 million programs in New Jersey and nationally to really improve and help people with disabilities get into the workplace. We funded new business initiatives, we funded training programs, we funded job creation, but really our niche, if you will, is to be an innovative funder. So we fund those initiatives that other people will not fund that can really move that needle on employment to make that systematic change to increase diversity and include disability in diversity within corporate settings. Disability is not always included in the diversity discussion. And I wanted to make sure I was the voice of disability because that's most of our work. And after raising 2 young adults with disabilities, I think it's important that the workplace recognize that this is an important part of diversity and inclusion. I was talking to some before, and really mental health, which is an invisible disability, is the most prominent disability in the U.S. So it's not disability as a person in a wheelchair, a person that's just with a cognitive disability. It could be somebody who has diabetes who needs to take insulin during the day. It could be somebody with cancer who may have to go out for treatment. So I think it's a very important part of this discussion is that when we look at what traditionally is D&I populations, that we also make sure that disability is part of this discussion. Mm-hmm. So it's really good for business. Right? I mean, to have a diverse population is good for business. And what businesses are finding out is that the disability population, other underserved populations, have huge buying power. And the people related to them and their interests are a great source of marketing for companies, and companies are starting to target these diverse populations. And what better way to understand what diverse populations need than by having a workforce that's diverse? There's Frances West, who was the Chief Diversity Officer and Accommodation Officer at IBM, recently published a book called Authentic Inclusion. And her definition of diversity is to look and embrace differences in your populations. I mean, that's what diversity is that businesses can do well looking at everybody's differences, and that really creates that innovation, that disruptive innovation that some people call, to move forward and push that business, because it's a confluence of factors. You have the principles, you have the purpose, and you have profit all aligned together, and it shows a business how invested they are in their people to help move a business forward. In 2017, Kessler Foundation with the University of New Hampshire sponsored a survey of supervisors of people with disabilities. So we looked at a business-to-business panel of 6,500 supervisors across the country. And to Avonia's point, what they showed is that the buy-in of supervisors and managers were coming from the impression they got from top down. So it was not just that, but then it's up to, okay, we've decided to do this, but then what's the culture change? How are we doing this within the company? What's the inclusion? But it all really is coming from the C-suite directive. And we also found that it comes with people with clout and numbers. So it's one thing for a manager to say, I want to have a diverse team, but if there's not money and budget behind it to really help that get some credibility in the organization, it's just not going to happen. So in our work with Pepsi America's Beverage and Lowe's and Office Max Depot, and in all the other companies that currently have large initiatives to hire people with disabilities, it's been an executive champion or a senior champion working with an executive sponsor who's really pushed these initiatives in the company, because there is that unconscious bias, as mentioned. There's discomfort and challenge to hire people that may look and act differently than you, especially when you're dealing with a disability, who may have some soft skills issues. We were talking before about eye contact. How do you interview somebody who has a disability? Maybe a little bit different. To onboard them, to support and training, get them involved in your culture is very different. But what we've also also found in our study that I referenced before is that companies like Walgreens and Amazon and Sephora, they've all worked with local providers to help them. So if you're a company who wants to do these initiatives, and maybe there isn't anybody, even on your D&I team, who are used to working with people with disabilities, which is a whole nother culture and ballgame, they've brought in local providers, and 91% of the companies that did that found it very effective. So we're seeing that more and more space is that some of the companies now are recognizing that they need talent in the community to help them work with their team when they look at onboarding, recruiting, and training. And adding to that, especially when it comes to individuals with disabilities, the algorithms, if you're on a kiosk, time out. They don't necessarily give enough time for somebody who has some learning differences to complete those applications. That is a huge, huge barrier. The same thing with some of the word choices. So when we worked with Pepsi America's Beverage in that project, they had they branded the whole campaign Achieving Change Together. And they ended up creating some different kiosks. And the jobs would open up the kiosk the same time as others, but they knew if it came in through a certain kiosk, maybe it was highly probable, but not necessarily for legal reasons, a definition of disability. So somebody with learning differences were encouraged to go through certain kiosks. At the same time, the jobs opened, and they probably knew if it came in through that portal, it was tagged as a disability. And it made a huge difference because it allowed people to get through some of the systems. Some of the corporation with the interviewing, we've talked about getting people in the door, but then what happens? What is your interviewing process? How are you, to talk about white privilege and some other issues, how are you training people to interview? Is your interview itself accessible to people with disabilities? If somebody needs an interpreter, if somebody needs some sign language, is that available up front? Does somebody ask over the phone, is there any special things you need during your interview to make it a more probable interview so that you are getting the best out of the person? Because after all, we all want everybody to come in and do their best and show the best foot to the company, and that always doesn't happen when you're looking at especially disability populations. And I just want to add, how about everybody staying in the workplace longer? So now we have people who've been in the same organization for many, many years, interacting with individuals who've just been there a few years and are put on the same project teams or the same interactions within the office. And we have a lot, even in our own office, we have a lot of young adults who are there between 25 and 40, and the baby boomers are saying, why does somebody just leave one thing left in a box, or why is there an empty box? And it's like being sometimes with your own family members at home. So that whole workplace culture, the shift between the generations is very, very different and can create some tensions, frankly. I would say that one of the challenges is to encourage companies to include disability as part of their diversity definitions and as a population. It's not just to the side, it's really part of everything else that everybody up here is trying to accomplish in D&I. Personal coaching can be very helpful also, that if you haven't developed some skills, and sometimes that can be sponsored by your own organization, or it may be something you want to seek out on your own and not let on, that you're seeking help for something. But that can fill in some of the gaps. So if you have been in a review and you're hearing that there's certain skills you lack, or you don't feel confident enough in a certain situation, using a personal coach can really boost your own confidence and boost your skill level. Another point is, what happens if you don't have a D&I officer in an organization? There are some very large systems here. What happens if you're 100 employees, 50 employees, 25 employees? Who is championing D&I within the organization? What's the culture of that organization? Again, when you're looking at disabilities and other diversities and you want to be inclusive, you're going to have to, some of that's going to have to bubble up from a champion in the organization to really work with people to understand, to make that change. And it also takes time. This is not going to happen overnight. It could take a period of years to permeate really the whole organization, to really become the DNA of the organization. I really appreciate being part of this panel and giving a voice to disability, which is not always in the D&I space. And I do want to encourage you that, there is a diversity supplier program that's certified by a group called Disability In. They used to be the United States Business Leadership Network. For those of you who are looking for diversity into supplier networks, there are staffing networks that also specialize, as well as local providers, in individual with disabilities seeking employment. So I'm happy to chat with anybody afterwards for any guidance. There are lots of consultants in the area too if you want to get a program going. But I really appreciate your time, and I think Atia, you did do a great job of bringing together the panel. And thank you, everybody.